being full on that event. So you can register online, and there are flyers outside and available for you. Something we just booked recently, many of you may remember Amanda Kemp, or know Amanda Kemp, one of our former students and a Cadbury Scholar, has just come out with a new book called Say the Wrong Thing, and she and her now husband Michael Germanis, who is a classically trained violin virtuoso, have put together an evening performance, in part based on readings from the book and partially based on the chaconne. So it's both a musical, reading, performance event, and that will be here at Pendle Hill on October 30th, a Sunday evening at 7 p.m. There'll be a free will donation to support their work, and it's also a prelude to a conference or a workshop that's going to be held here in February that's related to our conversation this evening, which is how to say the wrong thing, at least make those attempts in conversation interracially and intraracially so that we can make some progress. Final announcement for this week is that on Monday, November 7th, we will be having Paula Palmer here. Paula also was a Cadbury Scholar with us, and she has been working on the Quaker involvement with the Indian boarding schools and the attempt by the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches for denominations to recognize their role in the cultural genocide of Native Americans and to make amends and reparations for those activities that we may have undertaken with the best of intentions blindly, which we'll find out a little bit about tonight in our idea of what allyship consists of. Part of her talk is like, what did they think they were doing? And so understanding their intentions as well-meaning, we can do an awful lot of harm. And so I urge you to come and hear Paula Palmer that evening. Tonight we're delighted to have with us Drick Boyd, who is a professor of urban studies at Eastern University, but also a popular educator teaching courses on racism, urban theology, social activism, and leadership. He's a founding member of Heeding God's Call, which many of you may remember kind of originated with some thinking going on here at Pendle Hill with, I'm going to forget her name, but Joan will remember, right? No, you won't. Therese Miller.
Oh, yes.
And that's trying a faith-based organization seeking to curtail gun violence in the city with some direct nonviolent action to get gun shop owners to adhere to the law and not to be reselling guns to third-party shills. Also, he's a leader in the education team of POWER, which many of you know is an interfaith social justice organization, a network in Philadelphia. And I know him as a fellow member of NUCOR, New Conversations on Race and Ethnicity, that meets once a month for ongoing listening to one another's stories, an interracial group, and then an ongoing group, Whites Confronting Racism. He has written numerous articles and made presentations on whites and racism, popular education, spirituality, and critical pedagogy. He is currently at work on a book on the spirituality of Brazilian popular educator Paulo Freire. So we're looking forward to his next book. The genesis of the topic for this evening, however, is his last book, White Allies in the Struggle for Racial Justice. So if you join me in a period of worshipful silence, Drick Boyd will speak to us out of the silence. He will leave a period of time for question and answers. Because we are being live streamed, if you will hold your question until I approach you with the microphone and hold it just about where I'm holding this one, it picks up very nicely, but you have to hold it close. So without further ado, let us just have a little bit of settling silence.
Good evening. As John said, my name is Drick, and I am chair of the Urban Studies program at Eastern. We're a program that trains students in community development and youth development, and we have a certificate program in community arts, and also are looking to start a program in juvenile justice ministries. So we are training folks to be involved with communities on the ground, and so it's a great work. I want to thank Pendle Hill and particularly John Meyer for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure. This is a very special place. I'm sure all of you have your Pendle Hill stories, and I have my own Pendle Hill story. I'm a member of the Mennonite Church, and Eastern is a university that is affiliated with American Baptist Churches USA. But when I was living in Boston in the late 1970s, there was about a year that I was a part of a couple different Quaker meetings. And at one point, I went over to the Quaker meeting in Cambridge, which was not too far from Harvard University, and there was a rack of brochures, and there was one on Pendle Hill. And I read this, and I thought, wow, this sounds like a really neat place. And this exotic place in the mountains called Wallingford. It'd be really cool to go there. You know, I didn't have any money to go there at that time, but I thought that really sounds like a nice place. So fast forward about 25 years, and my family and I moved to this area in 1992. And I was driving around, just trying to get to know the area. I live about 5 or 6 miles up the road here in Broomall, and I was driving around just trying to get the lay of the land, and I saw a sign somewhere not too far from it said Pendle Hill. And I said, Pendle Hill, where did I hear that name? And it was that wonderful mountainous place called Wallingford. And actually, so I drove down the road, and I almost missed it because it's in the neighborhood here. But since discovering Pendle Hill, I've been here many, many times. Most often, I've come here just for a day. Got a room and just walked the grounds, and usually was kind of thinking through things, reading my journal, and that sort of thing. A few times will just come over here in the mornings when you have a morning meeting, and just that half-hour silence is a great way to start the day. And I have taken advantage of a few of the courses as well. So this is a very special place for me. And my wife is a social worker, or is a retired social worker, but for many years worked for Family and Community Service in media. And in the mid to late 90s, every year here at Pendle Hill, we had a ceremony commemorating and remembering those who had died in the previous year of HIV/AIDS. Because, as you know, in the 90s, diagnosis of AIDS usually meant you had 2 to 3 years to live. And my wife, her clientele was primarily people with AIDS. And so she and Lloyd, the groundsman here, would set this up. And so there are a number of trees, which are now quite big, that are all over this place that have a memory attached to them. And so it's a very special place in that way as well. When John and I arranged to have this date set aside for this first Monday talk several months ago, we certainly expected the topic to be relevant, but we obviously had no idea the context in which we would be talking about what it means to work for racial justice. I mean, in the last 2 to 3 weeks, there's been another 3 that we know of shootings of unarmed black men by police officers. Earlier this summer, there were shootings of police officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge, and actually just a couple weeks ago in West Philadelphia. We couldn't have known that a second-string quarterback could stir up such a controversy by sitting down at the singing of the national anthem. And it just seems to me that the intensity of the issues around racial justice, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of how they're related to other things a little bit later in the talk, how that intensity would be at such a fever pitch now in the midst of perhaps the most racially polarizing presidential election that we've had in years, even more polarizing, I think, than 8 years ago when Barack Obama was running. And I suspect that many, if not all of you, are here tonight because, like me, you don't want just to be an observer of what's going on. You want to actively be a part of working for change. And so what I want to sort of talk around tonight is what is the role, particularly, of white folks? And what role can they play in conjunction with people of color to challenge and change a system that systematically and historically has discriminated against people of color in a myriad of ways. But before I jump into my talk, I feel like whenever I talk on this subject, I feel like I need to make a confession. And the confession is that I am a recovering racist. I am a racist. I grew up a white male in a predominantly white community that was part of a racist society and a racist political structure that gave me privileges that were denied to others. And I didn't even know I had these privileges for the early part of my life. I certainly didn't ask for them. But the day I was born, the doors were open to me, opportunities were presented to me, resources made available to me, simply because I am white, that were denied to others. Now, I worked hard, and people told me I had earned what I had worked for. But what I hadn't realized at the time was that the game was rigged, and that I had been given an advantage that others hadn't had. And I just thought that was the way it was supposed to be. I grew up in a community outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where most of the people looked like me, thought like me, had advantage like me, and we all thought we were the norm. And my parents were moderately progressive folks. We went to a moderately progressive church that even in the 1960s had a sister church relationship with an African American church in another part of the city. But even in that, sort of subtly, through things that were said and not said, we were led to believe that we were just a little bit better, a little bit smarter, a little bit more sophisticated. So that was why we, the liberal do-gooders, had to help those who needed our help. And it was well-meaning. You were talking about the Indian schools. It was well-meaning. But it made us feel superior. And it was what I have come to think of as sort of a progressive white supremacy. Now, I said I was a recovering racist. Those of you who've been through a 12-step program or know people who've been through a 12-step program know that when you get through the 12 steps, you never say, I am a recovered alcoholic, or I'm a recovered drug addict, or I'm a recovered gambler. You say, I am recovering. Because one of the keys to the 12 steps is that even after you have gotten yourself clean, every day you have to continue to work your program. When I was a young youth worker in Boston, I had the opportunity to meet a youth worker actually from Knoxville, Tennessee, named Jabbo Cox, who was probably in his 50s at that time. And when he had been my age, in his 20s, he had been addicted to heroin. And somehow, by the grace of God, he got clean. And so we were talking about that experience. He said, you know, Drick, even though I haven't used in 30 years, every day I wake up, I want to take a hit. And I have to convince myself to do otherwise. And it seems to me that's the way racism is. It's sort of like we are crack babies, born into a world addicted to something that we didn't even know we had. And to get well, we have to work it every single day. So I share that because I first of all, I just want you to know I'm coming to you. Even though I've written this book and made a few talks, and written a few articles, I come to you as someone who's still on the journey, still trying to figure it out, and still learning. I also share that struggle because I think, like many of us in this room, we really want to do the right thing. But before we can confront racism out there, we have to confront the racism in here. We have to come to terms with our own prejudices, with our own blindness, with our own ignorance, and those feelings that get stirred up in us that we don't know. We know we're smart enough now not to say those things. But it doesn't mean we don't think it and we don't feel it. And even sometimes we do say the wrong thing. I love the name of the forthcoming event. I often tell people when they say, I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. I say, well, you won't know it's the wrong thing until you do it. So you got to do it. That's the only way I've learned. And it's painful. And it's difficult. But those of us who are white in the room, we have to deal with the racism in here before we can deal with the racism out there. William Sloane Coffin said years ago that racism is America's original sin. And we and our white ancestors are the perpetrators and the beneficiaries of that sin. Our political leaders, especially in this season, always try to remind us what a great nation the United States is or used to be. But what we don't want to admit is, however great we think the country has been or is, that it was built on stolen land with slave labor on the backs of Latino and Asian and poor white laborers in a culture that used and degraded people while treating them as less than full citizens. And part of our healing is coming to terms with that, acknowledging that history and understanding how it has, in some way, sought to work against racism in their time. Men and women, people from the 1700s up to the present. And I chose to write about people who were not that well known. So, I could have added John Brown or William Lloyd Garrison and people like that, but I chose not to write about them because there's a lot out there about people like that. So the folks that I wrote about are much less known. And what I tried to do in the book was not just sort of tell what they did to fight racism, but sort of their process, how they grew up and how they got there. Because none of us arrived where we are now just like that. It's a process, it's a journey. And so I wanted to also help people see the journey that others had gone through, and not just what they had done when they were older. Now, let me also say a word about what I mean by the word ally. It's interesting. Shortly after I finished the book, and it was in the publisher's hands, but actually before the book had came out, I came across a number of articles critical of the term ally. And I thought, oh, great, here I am putting the book out right when everybody's criticizing the word ally. And there actually is a website I call Accomplices Not Allies. And the criticism of the term is that, as interpreted by the website, is that allies can kind of set off and say, yeah, I'm with you, go for it, I'm cheering for you. But they wanted someone who was right there in the trenches with them, who was going to be arrested with them, who was going to get gassed and sprayed and whatever with them. And when I think of what I mean by ally and the people that I've written about, I was thinking along the same lines. So maybe the term ally isn't the best word, but it was the word that's in the book. And my understanding of ally was actually helped by a talk I heard by a professor of African American Studies at the University of Texas. Her name is Dr. Omi Osunjoni L. Jones. And she said that allies are people who recognize the various forms of discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever, that these forms of discrimination are largely structural, and therefore allies must work with the targets of that discrimination to change those structures. But she goes on to say, but they do that not just because they want to help the other person, but they do that because they recognize that a world free of oppression is a world of dignity, of equality, humanity, and justice, and therefore is a better world for everybody and is a world that they would want to live in as well. And in this talk, then, she closed it by quoting a familiar quote, I think, probably to many of you in this room, from an Australian Aboriginal activist by the name of Lilla Watson, who said, if you come here to help me, then you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. That, to me, is ultimately the position of the ally. The point is that the ally is working side by side with people who are the targets of discrimination. And they are working for the same world, with the same objective. Because they recognize that a world free of discrimination is a world that works for all. Now, I will say for myself that this is what I aspire to be, but I don't go around saying, I'm a white ally. I just try to do the best I can and leave it up to others to determine whether that term fits me. So let me share a few stories. 2 stories about Quakers and 1 non-Quaker. So we are in a Quaker institution, and I think that's very appropriate for this topic because of all the religious groups in our history as a country, Quakers have really been leaders in speaking up against slavery and working against it. In fact, in Germantown, a group of Quakers and Mennonites got together in 1688 and put together the first anti-slavery petition in the history of the United States. The Mennonites then went off to Lancaster County and didn't do much more, but the Quakers kept at it for a long time. And probably more than any one person in that early period of the history to have an impact was John Woolman. This picture is actually a picture of a statue on Kelly Drive. There actually are no known images of John Woolman. So this is a statue simply called The Quaker, best I can do. The book is actually a copy of his journal. There is a John Woolman house over in Mount Holly, New Jersey. If you haven't been there, you have to call ahead to make an appointment, but it's well worth the trip. But John Woolman was from Mount Holly, born in 1720. And at the age of 23, he had an experience that literally changed his life for the rest of his life. In a journal that was published years after this event, even after his death, he talks about how he was working in a store, and he was instructed by his employer to write a bill of sale for a black slave that the store owner owned, who was then going to sell it to this other customer. And Woolman describes the experience this way. He says, "My employer, having a Negro woman, sold her and desired me to write a bill of sale, the man being waiting who bought her. The thing was sudden, and though I felt uneasy at the thought of writing an instrument of slavery for one of my fellow creatures, through weakness I gave way and wrote it. But at the executing of it, I was so afflicted in my mind that I said before my master and friend that I believe slave keeping to be a practice inconsistent with Christian religion." As he later wrote in his journal, he said he realized with this deep conflict, there was a deep conflict between his professed faith and values and this institution of slavery. And as he reflected on the harsh treatment of African slaves and Native Americans, Woolman wrote in his journal, "I was led into a close and laborious inquiry whether I, as an individual, kept clear from all things which tended to stir up or were connected with wars either in this land or in Africa. My heart was deeply concerned that in the future I might walk in the plainness and simplicity of a sincere follower of Christ." And for Woolman to walk in the plainness and simplicity of a sincere follower of Christ meant that for the next 39 years, he traveled up and down the East Coast, often on foot, going from farm to farm, talking with Quaker slave owners, seeking to convince them to either free their slaves or pay them a living wage. And actually, as he continued in his journeys, he became more and more radical, such that he would refuse sometimes to stay in the home of Quaker slave owners, and he would insist on paying the slaves if they served his meal or made his bed. And he refused to purchase items that were made through the slave trade, such as sugar and various kinds of cloth. And though Woolman was relatively unknown during his lifetime, when his journal was published, it became very widely known. And one historian by the name of Frederick Tolles says, more than any other single influence, it was Woolman's clear and steady voice that woke the conscience of Quakers and ultimately, through them, the white Western world to the moral evil of slavery. One man going house to house, talking with folks, saying you've got to change your ways. And so the Quakers in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, passed a resolution well before the Revolution, American Revolution, forbidding Quakers to own slaves. And that then influenced Quakers all over the country. Now, though the Quakers were the first religious group, you can go to the next one, to take a strong stand against slavery, their willingness to be actively involved in the struggle to abolish slavery was a contentious issue. And this is where the story of Angelina and Sarah Grimke come in. The Grimke sisters were originally from Charleston, South Carolina. They were good Episcopalian daughters of a prosperous slave-owning family in Charleston. First Sarah and then Angelina made their way eventually to Philadelphia after trying to convince their family and their church and the people in Charleston that slave owning was wrong, and they eventually were basically told, you better go north or you're going to get in trouble. So they went north, they came here to Philadelphia and got involved with the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. Now, of the two, Angelina was by far the more dynamic and more outgoing, and Sarah was the far more organized and practical. And so they made a wonderful team. And they were invited by a group of abolitionists who were being trained to go all over the country talking about the need to abolish the slave trade and the institution of slavery. They were the only women who were invited to that event. And after that training, they were sort of sent out to go into New York and up into England and all up and down Jersey and in this area of Pennsylvania. And Angelina in particular was a very dynamic speaker and was drawing huge crowds of women. One of the customs of that particular era was that a woman in a public speaking role could not speak to a mixed audience, could only speak to women. However, she was so dynamic that men started showing up. And they used to call this intermixing, they used to call it a promiscuous audience. I got a kick out of my pastor, who happens to be a woman. After I learned this, I said, you know, every time you get up on Sunday, you're talking to a promiscuous audience. And you know, that plus the message she had created huge tension throughout this part of the country around the issue of slavery and within the Quaker faith. And it kind of came to a head when she married Theodore Weld. William Weld, he's the libertarian vice president. I don't know if they're related. That's another book, I guess. But she married Theodore Weld, who was another abolitionist speaker, who was a Presbyterian. And both blacks and whites were invited to the wedding, and the ceremony was officiated by a white minister and a black minister. And because of that, they were excommunicated from the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. Angelina for actively participating and Sarah for being there. So even though they were doing, in a sense, what the Quakers had worked for, they had done it in a way that was not in line with at least some of the more quiet side of the Quaker family, and so were seen to be unacceptable. The Grimke's continued speaking and working throughout their life. Angelina actually became quite ill, so she couldn't travel and speak as much, but she wrote a lot. And she and her husband and Sarah supported the abolitionist movement until slavery was abolished, and then even into Reconstruction, they were very much involved in trying to institute some of the promises that were made and the amendments that were passed. Next one. The last story I want to briefly share a part of is probably my favorite person in the book. She's not a Quaker, wasn't a Quaker, but she was an amazing woman. Anne Brady. Anne Brady grew up in Alabama, but moved to Louisville, Kentucky when she was in her 20s. She was a young newspaper reporter, and it was in the early 1940s that she came to Louisville. And in 1954, she had an experience that allowed her to use her privilege as a white person. And in a sense, by using that privilege, it turned her life upside down. In March of 1954, Anne Brady came home from doing some errands, and Carl, her husband of 6 years, was talking to a man named Andrew Wade. Andrew Wade was a young man with a wife and a child and another one on the way. He was a World War II veteran. He ran his own electrical contacting business. He'd been involved in local politics through the Progressive Party, which is where he had met the Bradys, and they'd become acquainted. They weren't what you would call good friends, they just kind of knew each other. And Andrew had come to the Bradys to ask them for a favor. For months, he'd been trying to buy a home with sufficient space for his growing family, where they would have a house, a yard where the children could play in the new suburbs that were being built on the outskirts of Louisville. But there was no realtor who would show him a house, and there was no bank that would give him a loan to buy a house. And when the realtors did meet with him, they would only show him the older, poorer parts of the city. You see, despite his military service and his successful business, Andrew Wade couldn't buy a house in the all-white suburb of Shively because he was black. And so he'd gone to some of his liberal white friends and asked them if they might be able to help them, and they had turned him down. So then he came to the Bradys. And he was asking them if they would buy the house for him so that he could move into this community. You see, the only way that Andrew Wade could live in that community and secure the house of his dreams was if a white person bought it for him. And in a book that Anne later wrote and reflected on this particular incident, she said she was a little hesitant at first, but both she and Carl almost instantaneously said, yeah, we'll do it. Because as she wrote, any other answer was unthinkable. She later confessed also that she was probably pretty naive about what this would entail. But it just seemed like the right thing to do. So as the story goes, the Bradys bought the house, transferred the deed over to the Wades, and the Wade family moved in. And the very first night they were in their new home, a rock came through the front window, and a cross was burned on their front lawn. And so the Bradys helped them set up a 24-hour security detail. People would just guard the house all through the night. And they lived there in a very, very tense situation, hoping and expecting that maybe as time went on, tensions would abate. But tensions only went higher. And the media certainly vilified Andrew Wade for stepping out of line from where he belonged. But they also, in some ways, were even more angry at the Bradys because they had betrayed the unwritten code. And it got so out of hand that eventually the Bradys were arrested on charges of sedition and for plotting, this is true, for plotting the overthrow of the state of Kentucky. Now, I say that because it shows how bizarre and crazy racism can make people. They suffered greatly. Carl actually spent some time in jail. And eventually, the Wade family had to move out of the country, or out of the suburbs. I think they left Louisville, if my memory is correct. I know a number of the other white folks who helped with the security detail ended up leaving Louisville. The Bradys decided to stay. And sometime after all of this, one of the longtime African-American civil rights leaders in Louisville told Anne that she had joined the Other America. And though her husband Carl died in his 50s, and he was about 10 years older than she was to start with, she lived on well into her 80s, died just 10 years ago in 2006, and throughout that time continued to be a part of the Other America. You see her on the right there. This is a picture when she was in her 80s, and you can just Google her name and look for images, and you'll see pictures of her speaking at rallies in the early 2000s against the war in Iraq and other things. And she was an activist throughout her life, and now there's an institute in her name at the University of Louisville. So these are only portions of 3 stories out of 17. And there's a lot more to the stories of these people that I've shared, 4 people, than I have time to tell. But my hope in writing their story and the other stories was that they could somehow be instructive for us today. You know, I sometimes have students say to me, when we start talking about the civil rights movement, oh man, you know, I wish I lived back then. I'd be marching with Dr. King, I would be doing all that stuff. And I said, you don't have to go back in a time machine. Because you're living in a civil rights movement right now. We have students, mostly young students of color, young adults of color, marching the streets, hands up, Black Lives Matter, challenging the criminal justice system. We have groups throughout the country that are trying to dismantle and change the so-called school-to-prison pipeline and what Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow. We have people who are working for the Fight for 15, so that service workers and other and people working in retail who earn a minimum wage of $7.25 can have a living wage because they're supporting families. And most of those people are people of color. We have folks that are trying to come alongside of undocumented immigrants who have been characterized as rapists and thieves by one of our candidates, and yet are just trying to survive. We don't need to go back in the time bomb. We are living in the midst of a new civil rights movement. And it behooves those of us who are white to not simply sit on the sidelines saying, go for it, but to somehow get our bodies in the game. And in telling these stories, I guess my hope is that we might take some guidance from those who have gone before us, like John Woolman, being willing to make a conscious choice to influence those around us. That, like Sarah and Angelina Grimke, to follow their deep convictions about racism, despite pressure from their family and friends and even their religious community. That, like Anne and Carl Braden, that we are challenged to join the other America. That America that looks at what we call equality and liberty and justice for all as a lie. Because it's not liberty and justice for all, it's just for some. My hope in writing the book is that these stories might inspire and guide us to step into our own story. In the final chapter of the book, I highlight some common themes and that I see through most, if not all, of these stories. And I'm just going to quickly list them. We can, if you want, we can talk more about them. But I really want to get to hearing your comments and your feedback and your questions. But some of the common themes that I saw in most, if not all, of the people I wrote about was, first, much of their conviction to bring about change came about because they had personal relationships with people of color. We need to get out of our white spaces, and we need to develop relationships across difference. Because it's only when we get into those relationships, when we begin to hear the experience of others who did not have experiences like us, that we begin to realize that there truly is another America. Now, John mentions this group, Nucor, that we're a part of. That's really what it's about. We hear people's stories. And as many stories that I've heard, I'm continually amazed. And the part of my brain says, no way, that couldn't have happened. Police don't do that. No, police do that. They just don't do it to me. So, personal relationships. Secondly, we have to have a compelling moral conviction. For many people, it is a religiously based conviction. But there are also people who are just deeply, deeply concerned about justice. And it's not something that you just sort of show up and say, oh yeah, this is really cool. It's something that has to come from deep within, which is why we have to do that internal work. Because all those prejudices and fears and guilt, they get in the way of us really living through that moral conviction. Thirdly, we have to make a choice to go public with our opposition to racism. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily have to get out there and march. For many of us, that may be the case, but through writing, through speaking, through our networks, we need to go public. And if some of your white networks are like mine, that's not an easy conversation to have. I can go to family gatherings sometimes, and that conversation ends. How about them Eagles? It's tough sometimes, but it's important. We have to be committed to the long haul. This is something that has been deeply embedded in our culture and our history for over 350 years. It's not going to get changed next week, next year, 10 years from now. There needs to be a commitment to the long haul. And finally, for those of us who have privilege and power, we need to be willing sometimes to use that privilege and power in ways that can fight racism, and at other times, we need to be willing to revoke that privilege and power and stand with others and, in a sense, suffer with others. So I hope this gives you a little idea of some of the stuff some of the things I've talked about in this book, and the spirit that motivated me to write it. I thank you for listening. And now I'm really interested in hearing what you all have to say. So thank you very much.
I will just shut this down. Thank you very much. Very much appreciate it. I'm going to take the exercise of the power of the mic and the MC to ask the first question.
You learned that from Steve Lawrence, didn't you?
One thing that occurred to me and that I have a little, I want to do a little pushback on, and that is we have to work on the racism within ourselves first. And that work, as you said, is really never done. And there's an urgency about working on the racism that is within that I think compels us to both do that work, but also to be engaged simultaneously. It's not an issue, and I think this is one of those tensions that showed up in Quakerism. Is it the perfection of the self, or is it the growth within a society that you're trying to bend the arc towards justice? So,
yeah,
just to clarify what your actual thought on
well,
that.
I appreciate. Yeah, I think that it's not an either or. First, we're taking it to both ends. I think what I meant when I said we need to work on it first. I think there's a temptation amongst a lot of white folks to get out there and work on racism, and well-meaning, do and say things that are very destructive. And so when I say work on first, I think we need to pay attention, even when we're doing that, to our own work. Paulo Freire talks about the oppressor within, and how oppressors, in their effort to liberate the oppressed, actually end up oppressing them in another way. So that I just know from my own experience that there have been many times when I sort of rushed in thinking, oh, I'm going to really get in here and I'm going to help this situation, and I say something or do something, but upon confrontation with someone else and then reflection on my part, said, oh man, I just need to listen. I think often, and maybe this is more of a male thing than anything else, a white male thing, but sometimes we want to go in and want to take charge. And I think the first thing we want to do is we want to sit and listen and absorb what's going on. Because many times what we think is going on is not what's going on. Or what we think is important is not necessarily important. So I appreciate your clarification, but I do think that the work is urgent, but we will do more damage than good if we aren't very attentive to what's going on within. So,
Pay attention. Cardinal rule. Comments, questions from the audience. Do you want to call on people and I'll carry the mic?
yes, ma'am. Yes, you.
Me. Oh, okay.
And if you'll just speak right up to it like a lollipop.
I will speak right up to it like a lollipop, but I've got a really big voice, and some people here know that. Okay, so one of the things I'm aware of is that I really resent people who are going to fix us. And they say, well, let's get to Chester. Chester needs to be fixed. And we end up just making a bigger mess. I am old enough to say that I was, so after doing the sit-downs and what have you, a bunch of people from Swarthmore Friends meeting, and from the Unitarian Universalist Church in Media, and a lot of different denominations in Chester formed the Chester Repertory Theater, and we put on our first show in, I think, 1966, called In White America. And from that, I got to, yes, well, the Chester Times was around and the Bulletin was around. At that time, they wanted to know if there was any kissing in the play, but but what I'm aware of, and I've said this to a few people, including the starting lady here, is that I am also, I sort of got lulled to sleep and thought that things were really much better until a couple of years ago when the young man, when the group, this was only like 2 years ago, maybe 3, but a group had made arrangements to have their swimming at a country club. And this one little boy, he's there standing in front of the camera and he's crying. And it just brought back what happened to me at a 9-year-old or 10-year-old, whereby I was told the little colored kid had to eat in the kitchen. I knew my skin was different, but I didn't know it was bad until that day. And so I am aware that I am upset with myself for not noticing how I was lulled to sleep and thinking things were really better. But this year has taught me, I'm sorry, the Muhammad Ali Memorial really hit it home for me that I grew up in the segregated North. And we often don't like to think of the North as segregated, but it was so I had a time that I could go to the movie. There was a time we could go to the bowling lanes. They wanted the business, they just didn't want us there mingling at the wrong time. And yeah. Oh, I went the wrong day once. Thanks, Nance. But this year I'm very aware of saying, wait a second. Things are only this much better. But things, I guess, in life go through cycles. So I'm forgiving me and everybody else for not really paying attention to the fact that we didn't make that much progress. The only other thing I want to ask, I'm sorry, my voice is maybe too...
You're fine.
Only because I am aware that the pecking order when it comes to people of color, but you have Latinas and African Americans or blacks, but no Asians.
Oh yeah, Asians, maybe.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the groups that you said you had 3 groups, white.
Oh, in my class,
Class.
I just had, I had no Asians.
Okay,
I mean, occasionally I've had Asians, but no.
okay, just was wondering.
Yeah, just in that particular class, no. Well, and what's interesting,
Now, that class was about 5 or 6 years ago. I now have a number of biracial students, and they want their own group now too. So, or they want to be in 2 groups, or the assignment has gotten really complicated.
but in a good way. In a good way, it really makes us think.
And this is much more complicated, or at least I'm seeing it as a mature woman who is still stuck with the 20th century, because I don't use a smartphone. But it is much more complicated now, the whole racial scene. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank
Here's
you.
the mic. Thanks. There it is.
Right there, John. It's coming around.
We can count on Joan, thankfully.
Actually, this is just like a real big thank you. I actually bought your book. I lent it to someone, I don't remember who. But I had read the foreword where you talked about the word ally and what you'd learned. And I really, really was glad that was there, because I had been hearing people talk about ally as not being a great word. And I also want to really, really thank you for Anne Braden. I discovered Anne Braden in the 80s when I opened my War Resisters League magazine, and this is the first time I saw in print anything about the peace peace movement being racist. And I'm going like, yeah, wow, it was wonderful. So I'm so glad she's getting such a good publicity for her wonderful work in her life. Thank you.
I wish I had heard of her in the 80s too. It's one of those,
Oh, darn it, we should have known.
Thanks.
John's getting his exercise.
I know you know this, but I'm going to just put in the plug that racism is also a geographical question. I've just come back from North Dakota, and there's very rampant racism there. You don't have it identified in your slide group because you only could get on the screen so many pictures, I understand. But racism is just always has a us and other. And sometimes it's African Americans, sometimes it's indigenous peoples, sometimes it's, I don't know, it's called women a race if we want to. But I saw again things that I haven't seen since the 60s out in Dakota. So.
I will admit that there's
One of the things that publishers don't want books much more than 300 pages, so I really struggle. I should have had, and in retrospect, probably a story or two about that related to Native Americans. Probably should have had a story or two relating to the farm worker movement and the Hispanic issue. I mean, in the appendix, I have a list of all sorts of people I could have written about, and some of those folks are in there. But yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And the thing I think it's important to realize too is that we used to think about racism as sort of, if we understood the black-white sort of dynamic, then we could sort of transfer that to other racial groups, and we now realize that no, that's not true. We can't superimpose anything on any group. So for Native Americans, it has a different flavor. For Hispanics, it has a different flavor. And even within those large groups, there are certainly different experiences depending on the tribe, if we're talking about Native Americans, or nationality, if we're talking about Latinos. So it's very, very important. It gets more and more diverse.
First of all, thank you very much. I'm interested in the idea that you talked about with whites revoking their white privilege, not only using their privilege, but also revoking it. And I've had lots of conversations with other white people just around that question of, is that really possible? And how does one revoke privilege, which is unearned and which in so many ways comes automatically? So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what it looks like for white people when they're trying to revoke white privilege.
Well, let me affirm what's behind your question, which is, in a sense, I don't know that whites can ever be devoid of their privilege. I mean, there's I don't know if it's a book or it's a journal called Race Trader, and their whole thing is revoking your whiteness. And my argument is, whether you want to be identified as white or not, you are white in people's eyes. And you drive down to the city of Philadelphia, and you get stopped by a police officer, you are treated differently because you are perceived as white. So I want to affirm that. But I think when I use the term revoking or relinquishing privilege, it is to choose to be in a situation where you are in alliance with persons of color who may be in grave danger. So, for instance, there's a predominantly white group called SURJ, you may have heard of, Stand Up to Racial Justice.
Show up for racial
justice, and it's primarily a white group who have said we're gonna try and be on the front lines as much as we can with our comrades in the Black Lives Matter movement, so that if someone's getting gassed or someone's getting pepper spray or whatever the case may be, they're standing there and they're being part of it. sometimes, it's doing things that are on behalf of an issue that people of color are struggling with, where, in a sense, it's safer for you to do something than not. John mentioned that I'm a founding member of Heeding God's Call. We founded the organization by getting arrested in front of a gun shop. And there were, out of 12 of us, there were only 2 who were African American. The other 10 were white. And I happened to be arrested with one of the African Americans. And he was very glad he did it, but we're sitting in that jail. And he is very nervous that he's going to be treated in a different way than I am and the other white guy who was in there with us. And as he talked about it, I began to understand why that would be so. And this was not his first arrest, the first civil disobedience, and he had not had good experiences prior to that. As it turned out, he got out early and the other guy in my cell got out, and I got to stay in for an extra 12 hours. And one of the things I learned in that 12 hours was how many black people get arrested for silly things. I was there, and they were saying, let the protester out, let the protester. He thought, he could do anything. They were cheering for me in the end. But I realized when Michelle Alexander talks about the new Jim Crow, those 12 hours, that I was only one of those 12 protesters who were still in jail. I got a glimpse of what that looks like. And as awful as that experience was, it was very traumatic for me. Upon reflection, I was very glad that, in a sense, I had that experience. But, so I guess that's what I mean, is that, I didn't have to do that. It wasn't my issue. My neighborhood isn't getting shot up with illegal guns, but it seemed like the right thing to do at the time. But in my experience, it's always always contextual, and I think also in dialogue with people. But that's a great question.
So my question is about Black Lives Matter and your experience in not only moving in to support that activity, but also dealing with the reactivity that comes your way when you do that. Our church, our Unitarian Universalist Church, has had discussions about putting up banners, a Black Lives Matter banner. And the zoning regulation for signs in our residential area, because the church is very restrictive. But I'm just curious about your experience with how Black Lives Matter has taken on a life of its own and has generated the kind of reactivity that it has. Thank you.
Yeah, I know of it. A synagogue, or actually a church, a Baptist church in Wayne, and the Ethical Human Society in Philadelphia both have had their buildings defaced and their signs torn down for that very reason. They had a sign up like that. So no, I think it's really true. I think the reaction among whites to Black Lives Matter and wanting to say Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter or White Lives Matter, obviously, first of all, really doesn't understand the significance of that phrase and its context. I mean, basically, the meaning of that phrase for those who are who generated it and who are marching with that is to say Black Lives Matter in the same way that all these other lives matter, because they haven't mattered. But I think most whites, one of my frustrations is generally speaking, Americans have very little remembrance of history. And so we kind of tailor history to what fits and makes us comfortable. And certainly our textbooks and what kids are getting in school doesn't help. I mean, you probably all heard of the case a couple of years ago about a mother who took the school district to court because they talked about
The slavery era.
people were servants, you know. And actually, a couple of my students, we were in a school just a couple weeks ago, and they were looking at it was an elementary school history textbook, and you know, maybe 400 pages in this textbook, and it was like a page and a half on slavery. It's like just a blip. So we don't have a sense of history, and we don't really want to know that history. There's a wonderful place in Philadelphia called the Lest We Forget Slavery Holocaust Museum. If you've never been there, you want to go there. It's a private museum by a couple, Gwen and Justin Ragsdale, who have collected artifacts from the slave trade going back to the Africa, the Middle Passage, slavery era, Jim Crow era, even up to the Civil Rights era. And their whole point is to make the history concrete. And Mrs. Ragsdale, who's usually the one who gives us the tour, when I take my students, says, if you know better, you do better. And what she means is if you know the history and its impact on what's happening today, and she does a great job of helping make that connection in language, and behavior, and dress, and so many other things. Music. But I think one of the big challenges is we don't know our history. I think for a lot of white folks right now, it is a very scary time. I mean, Donald Trump's whole campaign is based on fear. And that fear is real for folks. Because at some level, we as whites have been socialized to believe that no matter what happens, things are going to be okay with us. I mean, if we could somehow solve this problem without creating some displacement of others and tensions, but you know, we can't do that. And you know, as the population becomes more and more diverse, you know, depending on which demographer you talk to, whether it's 2040, 2042, 2050, at some point, whites are not going to be more than 50%. And right now in our schools, that's already the case with the school age. It's people our age, you know, who are still, whites are the majority, but our kids and our grandkids, they're living in a different world than most of us grew up in. So I think when I talk with whites, and it was interesting, just recently, you know, I had some conversations with people who were not in agreement with some of the things I was saying here, and I have to keep in mind that this is terrifying for people. It is terrifying for people. When people are scared, they do terrible things. And but it's really, the other thing I guess I keep in mind, and one of the first teachers I had in a course on racism when I was in grad school said that racism is like a mental illness.
And so you need to treat people carefully, but you need to move them toward healing.
And so I don't have any simple answers to your questions, but it's a great question, and it's one that I think a lot about. I mean, one of my high school friends asked me, you know, does this book sort of represent what you see your mission being? And I said, well, the more I thought about it, I said, in some ways I think part of my goal in what this part of my life is to try and help white people
get ready for the
eventual shift that's going to take place. So here we are.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll put it.
My question, I wonder how you incorporate concern for social class as well, and maybe the Fight for 15 thing is something like that. But it seems to me that, I just a personal experience, is that if you move into a position of being, for instance, I was a housekeeper. but I've got an advanced degree, etc. And when you're in that position, you become invisible, you know? And so I wonder, maybe Martin Luther King toward the end was talking about the poor people's campaign as well. But I mean, the fight for 15 people, there's a whole class of people, if they don't work that day, they don't get paid. If they're sick, they don't get paid. I mean, William Barr was talking about some of that stuff too, about people, two homes that have 2 wage earners, but are still in poverty. So somehow I think we've got to somehow also address that we're racist, but we're also such a class-based society. And I don't know, people were you talking about that as well?
Yeah, in the whole area of race and ethnic studies, there's a concept called intersectionality. And the basic premise of intersectionality is that all these isms, I'll call them, classism, racism, sexism, homophobia, what have you.
Capitalism.
What?
Capitalism.
Capitalism, ableism, ageism, they all intersect and affect our standing within society. So for instance, you could have an educated African-American woman and a poor white guy with a high school, or maybe not even a high school education. Who has more social capital in that polarity? Well, we're looking at sexism, maybe the man has a little bit more. But if we're looking at race, maybe the white guy has some more. But if we look at education and the socioeconomic status that gives a woman, she has more. So they do interplay. The thing about race and class in particular, at least in this part of the world, in the Philadelphia area, is overwhelmingly those service workers who are who got two wage earners and are still below the poverty line, tend to be people of color. Not 100%. There are a lot of white folks who are working at McDonald's too, who are working at Walmart, but they're a greater than proportionate group of people are also affected by race. So I think, yeah, we can't just talk about race. We can't just, I think in the 60s and early 70s, we kind of segmented it. So we talked about, there was the feminist movement, we talked about sexism, we talked about racism, we talked about class. I think we've come to a place now where we realize that argument is not the argument we should be having. The argument is how do these things interplay with one another. And so I entirely agree that class has a lot to do with this overall discussion.
However, it seems to me that...
Wait, hang on. If you're going to comment, do it so everyone...
Okay, so it seems to me there's lots of evidence that shows that white people have a very short memory. So where all of these immigrants came in after World War II, herds of them. And so where there was a time whereby the Italian, so what you do, not that long ago, before John F. Kennedy, a WASP was the thing. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. If you were Italian, you were more than likely what? Catholic. But no, so you get this whole little thing about cleansing, scrubbing yourself so you make yourself a bigger class in your mind. Makes no difference that you're also, I'm sorry, but that whole thing of class, we scrubbed ourselves clean to make us, I was in a situation where they said, well, who's it? When you think that you're upper middle class, and really, you're not, but you're white, you're wrong. Never mind. It just bothers me.
Well, but the other side of the historical issue is if we look going back to the 1600s, shortly after Jamestown, there was a rebellion. There were African slaves and there were white indentured servants. And they got together because they said, we're all getting our clocks cleaned by the plantation owners. And there was something called the Stono Rebellion. And they basically were rebelling against the oppression of the landowners. The landowners were able to suppress the rebellion, but they learned something in that. And what they learned is, we can't let these poor white folks and these poor black folks work together. So what did they do? They went to the white folks and they said, listen, we'll make you the overseers, okay? You get to keep these black slaves in line. And you look at who fought for the South in the Civil War. It wasn't the landowners. It was the poor white folks. And I suspect a lot of you know Tim Wise. Tim Wise tells a story about after Katrina, the two hardest hit communities were the poor white community on one side of the dam, and the poor black community in the Ninth Ward. And the politicians played them off against one another, rather when they should have said, hey, why are our communities the last to be rebuilt? They're rebuilding the stadium and the tourist, but we're still sitting in muck. I think the thing that frustrates me the most about the Tea Party, I can listen to the things that they're concerned about, and I'm saying, well, why are you going against these black folks? You guys got the same problems in many ways. You could be a much more powerful force. So I think the other side of what you're saying, and you're absolutely right, is that one of the patterns in our history, and it's still going on, we find that the powers that be will put these two groups. So what frustrates me about Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter in part is, wait a minute. It's the same old game. It's the same old game. Just different colors maybe, but it's the same game. Yes?
Well, I was going to speak to what you're saying, and it is, again, go back to not teaching our history. There were as many white indentured folks in the South and in households as you can imagine, and at that time, deliberately, they were set against each other to be a buffer zone. And that game, if you want to call it a game, has been played ever since. And it's still being played. And if you talk about the 1% and then the rest, there is no strong movement of unity and ability to see one another's common needs and background and strength in numbers even as a way to begin to deal with the inequities in our society. And capitalism plays a big part in all of this, as it did then, when this co-opting method was introduced and continues right up to our present day history. Sometimes when I'm talking to people and I want to be a little bit more dramatic about that history these days, I say the first Europeans who came here saw the indigenous population and said, we want what's yours, and killed them and took it. The second came dragging a slave to shore. And from that moment forward, from the beginning of the history of growing aspirational America, which is yet to be realized, that's been the reality, that's been the truth. We have to teach the history. We have to learn the history. Sure, it's important that we know ourselves and each other, but we're as complex as anything else as beings, and so it's not an easy lesson on any level to learn. But if we don't accept, find the realities between climate change and our inability to come together, it's doomed and it's scary. And the Atlantic Monthly had an article 3 years ago, I think, about the fear rising, particularly among white males, about their decline in the population and the loss of power and so on. These things are not invisible, but they're not universally acknowledged or understood. And so there's huge work to do. So the kinds of things you suggest are really important. But we have to reform our schools. We have to teach the history. We have to. If we don't, there's no way past it. We were struck when we saw that Michael Murray's movie, Where Should We... Well, that's not his name. Michael, yeah. Where Should We Invade Next? That some of the stories that he was telling was not about invasion and war, but even American ideas that had been taken elsewhere and implemented. And in Germany, it's powerful to see how much they acknowledge and teach the Holocaust and acknowledge the horrors that were committed, and how that is having an effect on that society. We are so far from doing that and similar things. I could go on and on.
Well said.
Is there someone else? I'll come back to you, Bill.
First of all, thank you very much. I have two kind of disparate thoughts. I just feel like mentioning how groundbreaking it was when Bill Bradley in the United States Senate 15 or 20 years ago asked in the chamber how many people in this room have had a discussion about race with someone of a different race. That was groundbreaking at the time. Now we are, fast forward, we are a month away from possibly electing an astonishing, seemingly cataclysmic bigot to the highest office in the land. And if he wins, I'm just interested to hear you think out loud about what that might be like in terms of race relations. Sorry to ask at the end. And if he loses, you know, what do you think about where we are then? Thank you very much and good night.
So I think we're going to wrap up.
You can pass on that question as far as I think the number of the folks in the audience were.
Well,
you want to speculate on what would happen if we got a Trump president?
It's a terrifying thought, and I agree. But I think whether Donald Trump wins or loses, we still have a lot of work to do. I was with a group of men from our church a weekend ago, and we were talking about at that point the upcoming debate. And one of the guys said, "Does anybody in this room?" There were about a dozen of us. Does anybody know anyone who is really supporting Donald Trump? And out of a dozen of us, no one knew anybody personally we could point to. And then he said, "That's part of the problem." And I think, so whether Donald Trump wins or loses, I do think that on this issue and a number of issues, we've got to figure out a way to reach out across our divide and begin having some kind of conversation. It won't be an easy conversation, it won't go quickly, but I think we need it. But I think also, if at least my first thought is to move to Canada, but my second thought is, no, I'm not going to do that. My wife might, but I'll keep the house here. No, she wouldn't do that. But is that I think the activism will be heightened. I mean, I hope that it is heightened, and it may become in some ways more. It could become more violent, which is scary, both amongst the demonstrators as well as those who are trying to stop the demonstrations. But I think we have entered into an era where this confrontation has to happen. You know, I've studied a lot about the civil rights movement, and you know, it's all been kind of cleaned up and made to sound very orderly. But you know, you go back to the Montgomery Bus Boycott and what was happening. They had no clue what they were doing. Now they were well organized about as far as the buses were concerned, but what they were unearthing at that point, they had no idea. And we often hear about sort of the high points, but there were a lot of low points. And you know, in 1968, when Dr. King was shot, you know, a lot of the cities erupted, and people said, "Well, he really didn't do much." He did a lot, to your point, but there was still a lot to do, and there's a lot. So I think we are in that kind of era, and you know, as an educator, one of the things I see that I can do is just to let young people know, you got to get on board with this. You know, just following your career, and it ain't going to happen. You know, you are going to get derailed at some point, so you might as well just make this a part of your life.
This should be the last. Let's see. Should be the last question. So thank you.
So the first thing is someone that's in education one of the fears of the white males is the fact that women are really advancing much faster in greater numbers in education. And I'm talking about the professions and everything else. And I think that is a real threat. The other, it is. It's a real change. Yeah. And it's a threat to them. And it's also a major advance to moving things forward. Because things change when you got different people making those decisions. And the other thing, we haven't talked that much, William Barber's name has been mentioned several times here, but his activism and the way in which he's sought to organize things from the ground up in North Carolina and encouraged other states to move on their own, I think is a point of great hope for the country to take the issues as seriously as he is framing them, given your intersectionality that you reference, but also the fact that this is a moral issue. This isn't just an economic and everything else. This is a moral issue, and that's what this country is based on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all the questioners, and thank you, Drick.
Thank you all.
Drick has agreed that he will stay behind and sign copies of his book. If you have brought your copies, he's happy to do that out in the foyer. If you would like to purchase a copy of his book, the bookstore is open. You can get your book signed first and then go pay for it. That's the way we did it just last week. So out there in the foyer outside the bookstore is a section of this book. So if you'd like to go and
Yeah.